Welcome to my channel. You're not just a viewer, you're the reason we're here. If everyone who watches subscribes, we'll build an awesome community. Your support drives us, without it we're nothing. So hit subscribe, and let's make something incredible together. Thank you, let's dive in. The air was thick with smoke and the bitter tang of gunpowder. Colonel Vasil lay on the cracked earth of Charticle 1, a small village near the Iraq-Turkey border. Blood seeped from a bullet wound in his chest, staining his uniform a dark crimson. His breaths came in shallow gasps, each one a battle against the weight pressing down on him. Around him, the sounds of war faded, the crack of gunfire, the shouts of his team, the distant rumble of a destroyed tank, all melting into a quiet hum. His vision blurred, but he could still make out the shapes of his men. Oguz, Bakir, Arif, and Baran, rushing toward him, their faces tight with fear and determination. "Stay with us, Colonel," Oguz shouted, dropping to his knees beside him. His voice trembled, a crack in the armor of the soldier he'd become. Vasil raised a shaky hand, stopping them. "No, listen," he rasped. His eyes, though dimming, burned with a fierce clarity. "Remember them, Mustafa Esref. Tell the nation, we stood for something." He coughed, a wet sound that made Bakir flinch. "The village, it's safe. That's enough." His gaze drifted past them, to the horizon where the sun hung low, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. It reminded him of home, of a daughter he'd lost long ago, her face flickering in his mind like a candle about to gutter out. "I'm at peace," he whispered, and with those final words, Colonel Vasil slipped away, his body still amid the chaos he'd fought to end. The men knelt in silence, heads bowed. The weight of his loss pressed down on them, heavier than the rifles slung across their backs. But this wasn't the beginning of their story. It was the end of a mission that had started days before, under a different sky, with a different purpose. To understand how they got here, we have to go back to the moment a single shot changed everything. The desert air hangs heavy, thick with dust and the murmur of death. A woman kneels, her hands bound, her eyes defiant even as a blade glints above her. Seda, a Turkish journalist, stares into the abyss of an ISIS execution, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a quiet fury. She'd come to the Iraq-Turkey border to tell the world the truth, about the innocent lives crushed under terror's heel. Now, her own story teeters on the edge of a brutal end. The militants adjust their camera, eager to broadcast her death as a warning. Arif's finger rested on the trigger. He didn't hesitate. The shot rang out, sharp and final, and the militant dropped, a clean hole in his head. Chaos erupted. The other terrorists spun around, weapons raised, but they didn't see the 7 Turkish Special Forces operatives who'd blended into the shadows of the civilian crowd. The rest of the team followed, Baybars, Mustafa, Esref, and Vasil. Each strike calculated, each blow landing with the weight of their training. Within moments, the terrorists lay dead. Vasil kicked the camera to the ground and crushed it under his boot, ensuring their message would never spread. Seda, still on her knees, looked up at them, her breath ragged. Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. "Turkish Special Forces," Vasil said, his tone clipped. "We're here to bring you home." Seda's eyes narrowed. "Why me? There are others, hundreds of them. Why just me?" Bakir stepped forward, his limp barely noticeable despite the pain in his leg. "You're Turkish. That's why." She shook her head, pushing herself to her feet. "That shouldn't matter. An army's job is to protect people, any people, not just their own." Vasil's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He'd heard this before, from others who didn't understand the limits of their mission. "We have orders," he said simply. "Oguz back here, stay with her. We move now." Seda's protests faded as the team surrounded her, their rifles scanning the horizon. She didn't know it yet, but these men weren't just soldiers. They were survivors of a brutal path that had forged them into something unbreakable. And their journey with her was only beginning. Weeks earlier, in a training camp nestled in Turkey's rugged mountains, Bakir and Oguz had stood among 200 soldiers, sweat dripping from their brows. The air was cold, the ground hard, and Colonel Vasil's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "This isn't about glory," he'd told them. "It's about duty. 20 of you will join this unit. The rest go home." Bakir's leg ached, a souvenir from a mission years ago, when shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone. Oguz rubbed his shoulder, where a steel implant creaked under his skin, a reminder of a bullet he'd taken for a friend. Some officers had whispered they weren't fit for this, that their injuries would drag the team down. But Vasil saw something else in them, something raw and unyielding. "You'd have done the same," he'd said to the doubters, his voice firm. "They've earned this chance." The training was hell. One test forced Bakir to run a mile in under a minute, his legs screaming with every step. The commander had loomed over him, cold and unyielding. "Fail, and Oguz pays for it," he'd warned. Bakir gritted his teeth and pushed through, collapsing at the finish line with seconds to spare. Another night, they'd been bound and thrown into icy water, a sponge soaked overnight between them. If a single drop fell by morning, they were out. They shivered through the dark, hands numb, but held steady. The worst came last. For days without food, a feast laid out for anyone who'd talk. The officers turned to torture, water dripping over a towel on Bakir's face, choking him. "Your name," they demanded. He stayed silent, then started humming a folk song, his voice steady even as his lungs burned. Vasil watched from the shadows, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "A diamond in the fire," he called Bakir later. Out of 200, only 20 made it. Bakir and Oguz were among them, chosen for this mission. Not for fame, but for a promise to honor a fallen commander, Kemal, whose memory lingered in every order Vasil gave. Back in the present, the team moved swiftly through the desert, Seda in tow. The rescue had been clean, but danger still lurked. Arif's voice crackled over the radio. "Colonel, ISIS forces, closing in fast." Vasil's mind raced. He set a trap, a decoy radio signal left behind as they retreated. When the terrorists arrived, drawn by the bait, 3 tanks roared to life from a hidden ridge. Shells tore through the enemy ranks, dust and screams rising into the air. 2 survived the barrage, scrambling for cover, but Arif's rifle barked twice and they fell. The team pressed on, but the war zone thickened around them. Explosives lined the path, a silent threat. Vasil knelt by a ticking bomb, his fingers steady as he traced the wires. Oguz fought off an attacker, taking a blow to the chest before Mustafa dragged him clear. The bomb's timer stopped with seconds to spare, and they exhaled as one. The next morning, under a pale sky, Oguz showed Seda how to hold a rifle. Her hands shook as she aimed at a rock. "How do you live with it?" she asked. "Killing someone?" Oguz's eyes darkened. "It leaves a scar here," he said, tapping his temple. "You don't forget." Their lesson was cut short by a cry. Ahead, a young girl knelt in the dirt, terrorists looming over her, a torch in hand. Seda's face paled. "We can't just watch," she said. "It's not our mission," Vasil replied, but his voice wavered. The team exchanged glances. Oguz's jaw set, Bakir's fists clenched. They couldn't turn away. "Attack," Vasil ordered. Arif's shot took out the torchbearer, and the team descended. Bullets flew, and Bakir grunted as a sniper's round grazed his arm. Oguz shoved Seda behind a rock as Arif hunted the shooter, finally silencing him with a shot through the scope. The girl, trembling, ran to Vasil, her whispered, "Thank you," piercing his heart. She reminded him of his daughter, lost to a bombing years ago, her prayers echoing in his memory. Nearby, a dying soldier groaned, a former Gervani fighter turned victim. His wounds were too deep, his pleas for release raw. Vasil hesitated, then pressed morphine into his hand. "End it," the man begged. With a heavy nod, Vasil complied, a mercy that left him hollow. They reached Charticle 1 by nightfall, a ramshackle village of lost souls. The elder greeted them with bread and gratitude, but rest was fleeting. A villager, Baran, lay dying from a gunshot, and headquarters warned of an ISIS assault. 100 strong, headed their way. "Leave now," the radio crackled. "We should stay," Oguz said, his voice firm. "These people, they've got no one." Seda glared at Vasil. "You'd abandon them? You're a coward." The words stung, but Vasil saw the truth in her eyes. "Oguz, you'll make a fine officer," he said, then turned to the team. "We stay." The morning sun hangs low as a helicopter thumps down into the village, kicking up dust. It's here for the children, including Tseida, whose feet drag as she nears the door. She doesn't want to leave, not the village, not the colonel who's become like a quiet anchor. "You've got to go," he says, pressing a letter into her small hand. "Open it in Turkey. Keep this between us." Her eyes search his, then she nods and climbs aboard. As the chopper lifts off, he stares after it, a flicker of hope battling the weight in his chest. Back on the ground, he gathers his team, his brothers in arms, and lays it out plain. They're staying. Headquarters buzzes over the radio, skeptical, but he's already made up his mind. The village is defenseless without them. They huddle up, sizing up the fight ahead. Terrorists are coming, and their ammo's thin, 4 magazines each, passed out with a grim nod. Bay Bars, built like a bull, grins faintly. "I can make a bomb from my machine gun rounds. And we've got 2 rocket launchers if it gets bad." Arif, the sniper, heads for the mosque minaret, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Up there, he's a guardian, not a man at prayer. The colonel assigns zones, every angle covered, his voice steady as stone. He turns to the villagers next, pointing them to a bunker. "Stay inside. Don't open the door till we're back." Most shuffle off, but 2 step forward. Baran, a wiry kid clutching an AK-47, and a girl with fire in her eyes, offering to haul ammo. The colonel frowns, too young, but their grit sways him. Baran gets a hiding spot. The girl gets a job. Then it begins. Arif's signal cuts the silence. They're here. Not 100 like they'd braced for. Over 200, rolling in with an Abrams tank that gleams like a beast. They've got a mind set, and he waits, breath held, until the terrorists hit the mark. The remote clicks. The ground erupts, swallowing dozens. Arif's shots ring out, dropping snipers, though one slips past, a miss at the tank's driver. The front line's a storm. The colonel and Oga's fire and duck, but the tank keeps coming. The girl weaves through bullets, arms full of ammo and rocket launchers, her jaws set tight. Arif keeps them alive from above, until the tank's crew zeroes in. A shell slams the mosque, rubble raining as he's battered but breathing, still shooting. The tank breaches the village. Baybars grabs a rocket launcher, and with Oga's and back here, they blast it to scrap. Victory's close, but costly. Mustafa steps up, eyes locked on the colonel. "I'll cover you," he says, voice thick. "For a hero." He charges, pulling fire, and gets swarmed. Arif lines up a shot, but Mustafa shakes his head, handing over a grenade. "My son, take care of him." The blast rips through, and the team staggers, grief clawing at them mid-fight. Esraf's next, sniper fire tearing into him. Blood pools as he gasps to Arif, "Use me." No choice left. Arif props him up, Esraf's fading voice guiding his aim. A terrorist sniper falls. 2 gone, and ammo's down to 1 magazine each, 30 or 40 enemies still closing in. A suicide bomber looms. The colonel's last bullet flies but gets blocked. He lunges to disarm him, then a shot hits his back. Bogas, Bakir, Arif, and Baran finish it, cutting down the last terrorists. They reach the colonel, but he's slipping. "Remember them," he rasps, naming Mustafa Esraf. "The nation's with you." Peace settles in his eyes. He knows the village is safe. Colonel Vasil fades, joining the fallen, their sacrifices etched in the air. A memory cuts through, their mission's root. They'd come for a journalist who hated the army, her words venom. The colonel didn't flinch. "She's ours to protect," he'd said, duty trumping all. In Turkey, Tseida opens his letter, tears spilling as he calls her a daughter, praising her fight against wrong. Back at the village, 3 helicopters land, the Stormbringers battered but proud. Villagers cheer, hailing them heroes. They board, carrying their losses home.